All right, that's up and running. Got people on the Zoom connection. We'll just give it another minute or so for people logging in, and then we'll get down to work. We are picking up in chapter 14, Mishnah number 3. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. So good evening to everyone. Nice to see you or be seen if you're watching this through YouTube. It is good to continue this section of the Mishnah of Yevamot. Now we're continuing on with the legal implications of people who had diminished mental capacity in the ancient world. And so we are going to continue with some of the specific implications of marriages between people who are a deaf mute, a cheresh, who have this limited mental capacity in the ancient world. Once again, I will put the disclaimer that this does not apply in the modern world, thanks to modern techniques of communication and teaching. But in the ancient world, this was a significant problem. As such, we are going to see some of the implications. Now, this may seem a little nitpicky and convoluted and splitting hairs from the different categories we'll be going through. And well, I apologize if that's how it feels, but trying to make sure that the law is clear to cover all categories and cases of people and the different particulars of their life, I don't consider nitpicky. And if you were a person who had one of these situations, you would probably appreciate that the Mishnah had considered you and your circumstances in order to clarify the halakha should such a case arise. For the rest of us who may not be in this particular situation, having an understanding of capacity, diminished capacity, and how that plays together in circumstances often beyond our control, and there is nothing more beyond our control than the death of someone that is represented at the heart of Yevamot, of levirate marriage situations, is a very important thing to hold on to. If someone is thrust into a relationship, how does it get handled? And if they have a different standing in their prior relationship, how does the new relationship unfold? All of this is of great importance and great interest. Sometimes we have to think beyond our narrow confines or our familiar circumstances to truly see the beauty in the complexity and elaborate construction of Jewish interpretation. With that as the introduction, we are picking up with chapter 14, Mishnah number 3. And we are going back to the case that has plagued us a number of times. What happens when you've got 2 brothers and 2 sisters? And we're going to deal now with them in the unique circumstances that they are in. The Mishnah continues. In a case where there are 2 deaf-mute brothers married to 2 deaf-mute sisters, or to 2 halachically competent sisters, or to 2 sisters, one of whom was a deaf-mute and the other was halachically competent, or in a case where there are 2 deaf-mute sisters married to 2 halachically competent brothers, or to 2 deaf brothers, or to 2 brothers, one of whom was deaf and the other halachically competent. Okay, so we have all of these combinations, either 2 and 2, or 1 and 2, or 1 and 1, or 2 and 1, or 2 and 2. We cover every possible permutation in this particular situation. The important elements are, of course, the brotherhood, which is why we have levirate marriage at all, and the sisterhood, which you may remember that you are not allowed to marry your wife's sister. Now, the question is, does she count as the sister if the marriage that she is in is halakhically compromised, meaning that it is of a slightly less halachic degree because it was undertaken through an irregular form of communication that was not established through the Torah itself. Rabbinically binding, but not Torah binding, as we've talked about. So, in these circumstances, what is the ruling? All these women are exempt from chalitza and from levirate marriage, right? Each of them is forbidden to her yavam because he is married to her sister. And if they were unrelated women, that is, the women are not sisters, the men may marry them in levirate marriage, and if they want to divorce them later, they may divorce them. So, because of the situation they are, and because they are of equal status in all of these relationships of halakhically rabbinic marriage, they treat each other as not needing it. But if they were unrelated, that is to say, if they were not sisters, then it would, because of that similar level between all of the different people involved in the different possible combinations that we discussed at the start, all of them would still be able to undertake levirate marriage according to the rabbinic level of their marriages. Everyone got that? All right, this is our baseline. It gets more confusing from here. But don't worry, we're going to be finishing up with this as we go through all of our permutations and eventually transitioning into a discussion of what happens when a woman shows up and says that her husband died while they were on a trip. Is she released from that marriage or not? Just a little teaser in case you're getting frustrated with these different permutations. Mishnah number 4. Just a second. However, if two brothers, one of whom is a deaf mute and the other one halakhically competent, were married to two halakhically competent sisters, and the deaf mute married to the halakhically competent sister died, what should the halakhically competent brother married to the halakhically competent sister do? All right. So just to make sure we understand, here we have a more specific case. We're not dealing with the this one or this one or this one. This one we have two brothers, one a deaf mute, one not, and each of them are married to two halakhically competent women. So they are sisters. And the deaf mute married to the halakhically competent sister dies. So that means the deaf mute, whose marriage was of a rabbinic level, he passes away. What should the halakhically competent brother, the remaining living brother, do, who is married to the sister of the one of the widow? His brother's wife is released without levirate marriage or chalitza due to the prohibition with regard to a wife's sister. If, on the other hand, the halakhically competent brother married to the halakhically competent sister died, so now we're flipping who died, what should the deaf mute brother married to the halakhically competent sister do? He divorces his wife with a bill of divorce. As his wife's sister came before him for levirate marriage by Torah law, and the legal status of her marriage and her levirate marriage is higher than his own marriage, even though it was pre-existing, because it only applied rabbinic law. So he was perhaps happily married to this woman, but because his marriage was undertaken only by rabbinic authority, and the levirate bond happens by obligatory Torah responsibility, that means that technically his sister-in-law, the widow, now has a higher claim to him than his original wife. And that means he has to divorce his original wife because he cannot remain married to the sister of his wife, well, his new wife. And his brother's wife is forbidden to him forever, and there is no remedy for her. He cannot marry her, as by rabbinic law, she is the sister of his ex-wife, nor can he exempt her by means of chalitza, as he is a deaf mute, and the deaf mute cannot undertake that particular ceremony. So he is, the situation is messed up, I think we might say in the modern vernacular. He loses the wife he had, and he gains a wife that he cannot be with. And there is really no way to remedy this because of his diminished legal standing because of his diminished mental capacity and because of the differentiation between a rabbinically binding marriage and a Torah binding obligation. So we can have sympathy, but this is when something happens that is automatic. It's not being done by choices. It is simply happening. Unfortunately, sometimes the legal consequences can be extremely uncomfortable. Aaron.
Hey, before they created sign language, in one of these situations, did the rabbis ever try to annul the marriage of the dead brother?
I don't have any records of that, but certainly that would be a possibility. But the difficulty would be trying to retroactively annul the first marriage would be the issue. Since they can't. The first marriage was the one that he had before his brother died.
All right. You wouldn't want to annul the marriage between the dead brother and the wife?
Well, he can't. Oh, you mean between the deceased?
Yeah, deceased.
To the best of my knowledge, I have never seen a case of annulling a marriage after a person has died.
But that would cure the problem in this case, right?
If it were legally possible, but like I said, that is not a case. I've never seen any discussion of doing an annulment for the dead. In general, once somebody is passed away, their status is complete. And I've never seen an issue where that is changed after the fact of their passing. We are not the Middle Ages. We don't dig up dead popes and put them on trial. That is the real thing. We don't do that. The dead are dead and their status is usually finished, as far as I am aware. If someone can find an obscure example and let me know, that'd be very fascinating. But annulling the deceased brother's marriage is not something I've ever come across.
But the wife is still is not dead, so doesn't she still have an issue as being not dead?
Right, but she is not dead, but she is also no longer married to the first brother, the dead one. Because when he dies, her marriage to him ends.
All right.
Like instantly. That's why if he dies, she can remarry. If there were children and she was free to do so without levirate marriage, just in a standard situation, man, wife, 2.3 kids, he drops dead, she can get married the next day. It's not considered seemly. Judaism frowns on that. But technically, if she did, it would be legally binding. I don't think you'll ever find a rabbi who would officiate at such a travesty. But technically, she is free once he is confirmed as dead. So there's no longer a marriage to even annul in that situation. She is instantly bound in our case, however, to her brother-in-law, to the levirate process. So once that happens, that's not a marriage that can be annulled because it wasn't a marriage that was freely entered into. It was a marriage that was instituted, an obligation that was instituted immediately, automatically, and irrevocably upon the death of the first husband.
But in modern times, if somebody refuses to do halitza, don't the rabbis sometimes annul the marriage inside the conservative movement?
In modern times for halitza, it hasn't actually been a problem that I've come across. It is it's not a problem that I've heard of people routinely refusing to engage in. As we've seen, the number of situations where chalitza is not the appropriate remedy is quite extensive, and so it's the few times when I have actually known of people who needed to do chalitza in the modern world has been handled quite fine without any resistance.
All right, I thought that was a problem in the Orthodox world where either chalitza or sometimes a guy would refuse to give a divorce.
Well, refusing to give a divorce is a much bigger issue.
All right.
But refusing to do chalitza, we're talking about people that are deceased. And there's a different level of ill will between an ex-spouses and between a widow and the deceased and the surviving brother. So the few times when I've known of chalitza needing to be done, the widow has generally had no problem, and the brother has had no problem as well participating in the ceremony in order to render it possible for her and him to move on without engaging in an extended question of levirate marriage. But yeah, divorce is very different because both spouses are still alive, and unfortunately, sometimes there is animosity in those situations, and that indeed can cause many problems with husbands who refuse to give a get. And in fact, that is where in the conservative movement, we use the annulment more typically because of situations where that is necessary. The only other outliers are where the husband has become mentally incompetent for one reason or another, and a divorce is needed. But of course, he cannot give a divorce because of his mental incompetence. And then, yes, under some circumstances, an annulment could also be used.
Where do they get the authority to do the annulment, though?
Well, they get the authority from the time when people get married. When someone gets married, they say that they are getting married Kedat Moshe v'Yisrael, that they are getting married according to the laws of Moses and Israel. And as the rabbis point out in Gittin, getting married according to the laws of Moses, that means you're getting married on the condition of Jewish law. Getting married according to Israel, that means you are getting married according to the sanction and approval of rabbinic authority. And what rabbinic authority gives, rabbinic authority can take away.
So based on that, the marriages are rabbinic then, right?
Because based on that, the marriages have as one of their underlying assumptions that they are sanctioned and approved by rabbinic Judaism. And if a person demonstrates in one way or another a violation of such critical principles that it becomes clear that they are in complete breach of Judaism and the rabbinic authority, then rabbinic authorities are within their power, do have it within their power to simply say, well, if that's the way you feel about it, then we are removing the authority that we allowed this to take place under. And that means there was no wedding. So when we get to Masechet Gittin, we can talk about this in much more detail. All right, Mishnah number 5. Have to wake the mouse up again. And we are continuing with our if-then statements. If two halachically competent brothers were married to two sisters, so now both brothers are competent, and the two sisters, one of whom is a deaf mute and the other halachically competent, so now we've swapped the sisters rather than the brothers, and the halachically competent brother married to the deaf mute sister died, what should the halachically competent brother who's married to the halachically competent sister do? So this time we have the deaf mute as the widow. What should the other brother do? Well, the deaf mute sister is released due to the prohibition with regard to a wife's sister. So he cannot marry her because she is the sister of his wife, and therefore she goes free without any additional ceremony. If the halachically competent brother married to the halachically competent sister died, so now we have the competent sister as the widow, what should the halachically competent brother married to the deaf mute sister do? Well, he divorces his wife with a bill of divorce, as the halachically competent sister came before him for levirate marriage, and the status of her levirate bond is higher than the status of his marriage to his wife, who was the deaf mute. So in reverse of the genders, it was the same that we saw in the previous Mishnah. However, and he releases his brother's wife, who is not a deaf mute, by means of chalitza, as they are both legally competent, both the husband and the wife, and can therefore perform chalitza. So the twist here is, of course, that he can do chalitza for his brother's wife, because both he and she are halachically competent. All right. Mishnah 6. If, I can scroll down a bit more. If two brothers, one of whom is a deaf mute, one of whom is a deaf mute and the other one halakhically competent, were married to two sisters, one of whom is a deaf mute and the other one halakhically competent. So now we have A and B and C and D. So we have a mixture between the brothers and a mixture between the sisters. And the deaf mute brother married the deaf mute sister. What should the halakhically competent, and that's the one who died. What should the halakhically competent brother married to the halakhically competent sister do? So now we have the two who were halakhically competent married and the two who were not married, and it is the deaf mute brother who dies, leaving the deaf mute sister as the widow. What happens in this case? The deaf mute woman is released due to the prohibition with regard to a wife sister. Again, the answer that we might begin to expect now because we are following the same pattern. If the halakhically competent brother married to the halakhically competent sister died, what should the deaf mute brother who's married to the deaf mute sister do? Well, he divorces his wife with a bill of divorce, which is as valid as their original marriage. So he can divorce his halakhically incompetent wife, because the same way they came together with a rabbinic level of obligation, they can dissolve that with a rabbinic level of dissolution. And so that means he can divorce her, even though he is halakhically impaired, and you might otherwise think he couldn't, he can, because of how his original marriage was created. And his brother's wife is forbidden to him forever, meaning there is no remedy for her, as he may not consummate levirate marriage with her because she is the sister of his ex-wife by rabbinic law, and he cannot perform chalitza with her either, as he is a deaf mute. So once again, we hit a dead end, unfortunately, because of the differing layers of halakha competency involved in this relationship. All right, let's continue with our permutations in Mishnah 7. And I promise there is an end to this. We're not going to be doing these forever. We'll work our way through. It's interesting to note that in some of the girsayot, some of the variations of how the Mishnah has been published, this whole set was published as one long Mishnah. Personally, I like having it broken up. It's much easier to keep track of. Still confusing, but because they are so thematically linked, it's not uncommon to find in certain published versions that all of these are one. And if you are reading along in a version other than Sefaria, and you are wondering why we're moving through rather than going through one, that's why. Mishnah 7. If two brothers, one of whom is a deaf mute and one is halakhically competent, were married to two unrelated halakhically competent women, and the deaf mute married to the halakhically competent woman died, what should the halakhically competent brother married to the halakhically competent woman do? So forget the sisters. We're now back into a more general type of relationship. Two brothers married to just two women. But the two brothers have one that is a deaf mute and one that is legally competent. The deaf mute dies. What happens to the brother who is alive and to the widow, who, remember, is halakhically competent? Well, the living brother either performs chalitza or enters into levirate marriage, meaning that he handles this completely normally. If the halakhically competent brother married to the halakhically competent woman died, what should the deaf mute brother married to the other halakhically competent woman do? Right? He cannot perform chalitza with her as he is a deaf mute. Rather, he marries her and may never divorce her, as sexual intercourse between a yavam and a yevamah creates a valid marriage that cannot be broken by the bill of divorce of a deaf mute. So he marries her, as is the obligation, because he has to do chalitza or marriage. He marries her, which means consummation, but he cannot divorce her because the bond that is created through the automatic betrothal process of yibum, of levirate marriage, is of a Torah level bond. And since he has diminished halakhic capacity because of his mental state, he cannot undo that bond with the level of divorce that he is capable of giving. So he then is married to her in perpetuity. Now, obviously, in the real world, they would find ways to work that out and come to some sort of arrangement for the families that are dealing with this tragedy of the brother dying and she being married to him, and perhaps he not being able to support her, and all of the other permutations. But as far as the legal crux of the issue goes of what needs to be done legally, he is married to her, and that continues without being able to be broken through a divorce. Yes, sir.
So, Rabbi, and I think you kind of hinted at this, does this Mishnah say they have to have relations with the girl even if it's against their will?
So against the will is an unusual topic, right? The whole concept of yibum, of levirate marriage, involves a certain level of obligation that supersedes personal choice. There is room for personal choice, and there is not. And this is something that is off-putting, to say the least, in the modern world, where we center everything that we believe upon the freedom of the individual to always be in charge of his or her own destiny and behaviors. Historically, both in Judaism as well as in many other cultures, well, actually all of them, the individual was not a completely autonomous agent, always able to decide exactly what was and was not best for them as an individual. There would sometimes be more or less of an obligation to perform certain acts, whether the person wanted to do them or not. And failure to comply was a breach of the social norms, or in this case, the mitzvah, the commandments, that a person was expected to fulfill. So yes, if the person was, either of them were especially loath to be intimate with one another, they were nonetheless expected to perform this act as a fulfillment of the mitzvah. Now, if they would try to come to an arrangement after the fact or find other ways out of this sort of situation, then perhaps they could come to some other understanding. But the obligation is one that begins without personal choice or involvement. It is triggered by the tragedy, and it is only remedied through the different ways that we have discussed.
What are the other options they would have? Because the way I read this, it seems like there is no other options than to have unconsensual relations.
Well, the other option would be to perform the minimum required for the fulfillment of the mitzvah, and then to live separately and to not cohabit in any way, shape, or form if they were having that level of difficulty with each other.
And with the minimal is just being in a room together, technically, right? With witnesses.
In this particular case, with regards to Yibum, consummation is expected to be more than just isolation.
All right, and
because of the mitzvah's specific wording in the Torah, and as we've seen through some of the other chapters, consummation in its physical form, even if it is the minimal required, is still the foundation of this particular mitzvah.
And if they don't like the situation, the girl is stuck with having without being able to remarry them, right? I mean, she cannot anything.
She cannot get married to anyone else because she cannot be married to two men at the same time, and the man that she is currently married to cannot divorce her. Right. However, if he passes away, not uncommon in the ancient world, then she would be a widow again and be allowed to marry whoever she wished. Once again, we come through the torturous path of the different permutations of the Mishnah to come up with the plot for a good mystery novel. All right, Mishnah number 8. If two halakhically competent brothers were married to two unrelated women, one of whom is halakhically competent and the other one a deaf mute, and the halakhically competent brother married to the deaf mute woman died, what should the halakhically competent brother married to the halakhically competent woman do? So now, rather than having one of the brothers be impaired, we have one of the wives be impaired. And the brother married to that woman with the legal impairment, he passes away. What does the remaining brother do? The brother cannot perform chalitza with her as she is a deaf mute. Rather, he marries the deaf mute, and if he wishes to divorce her, he may subsequently divorce her with a bill of divorce. So he can't perform chalitza because that requires her to be of legally competent standing, but he can marry her and then divorce her. And that works out to be much as the same in terms of releasing her. If the halakhically competent brother married to the halakhically competent sister died, what should the halakhically competent brother married to the deaf mute do? So now we have the one who's already married to the deaf mute presented with the non-deaf mute woman that is looking for redress. Either he performs chalitza or he enters into levirate marriage. He can handle this in either way. Okay, we're getting there. Last one. If two brothers, one of whom is a deaf mute and the other one halakhically competent, were married to two unrelated women, one of whom is a deaf mute and the other one halakhically competent, you knew it had to be coming. We got the 2 and 2 combo. And the deaf mute brother who was married to the deaf mute woman died. So two deaf mutes married to each other. She is widowed. What should the halakhically competent brother married to the halakhically competent woman do? He may marry her if he desires, that is to say, the deaf woman, and if he wishes afterwards to divorce her, he may divorce her. Again, he cannot perform chalitza with her because she is of impaired status, but he can marry her and divorce her as they wish. If the halakhically competent brother married to the halakhically competent woman died, flipping the tragedy, what should the deaf mute brother do married to the deaf mute woman do? Or what should the deaf mute brother married to the deaf mute woman do? He marries his Yevamot, he takes her as a second wife, and he may never divorce her. Like we saw in the last Mishnah, he does not have the legal capacity to end this Torah-mandated relationship. All right, any final questions before we leave this topic once and for all? All right, then let's deal with a topic which unfortunately is not as hypothetical. What we've been seeing for much of the last few chapters, and really much of Yevamot as a whole, have been hypothetical situations in the modern world. Yes, it is possible that you could still have two brothers and that one of them could die young, leaving his wife a widow, and that the other brother would then be required to, in the modern world, almost universally perform chalitza to separate that obligation. But it is a fairly rare occasion in the modern world, thank God. The mortality rate of young people has plummeted. Again, something that we should be grateful for. And that means that the situation which even needs a remedy is very rare. Likewise rare, but of more tragedy because of the pain and grief that goes into it, is when you have a woman that is married whose husband dies and you're not sure that he is dead. That is to say that he dies in some way that does not remove all doubt in a way that we might hope. Remember from other conversations, if you've been in the class for a while, the ideal would be that he dies with two legally competent witnesses having seen the death to be able to testify clearly that yes, he is dead, thus ending his bond and his connection to his wife, ending her connection to him, meaning she is now free to get remarried at the appropriate time. If there is a doubt over this, for example, he goes off on a trip and never comes home, and no witnesses, no amount of searching, nothing is able to determine his status, that creates a situation known as an aguna, where the woman is now anchored, literally, to him with no way within the normal course of things to sever that bond. There are some extraordinary steps that can be taken, but the Mishnah is going to deal with the ordinary issues. But what happens when it is in between? That's where we're going to start, where we have some reason to believe that he is dead, but it is not the, quote, perfect testimony that we might have hoped for. Under what circumstances do we believe this lesser testimony that is not coming in the way that would be of ideal sharing of information? With that all in mind, we're going to begin chapter 15:1. And again, a reminder that this is a very sensitive subject for many. And this is a subject that has continued to occur in the modern world around many significant tragedies. The most famous within the last 20 years, of course, was the tragedy of 9/11, where many Jewish men were in the Trade Center towers and finding a proper understanding and testimony about their fate to be sure that indeed they had perished, thus their wives could be declared widows, was a lengthy process in that whole tragedy, since there were so many cases of people who had died at that time. So this is not merely hypothetical, and it is not remedied in quite so simple a way as a ceremony like chalitza. And of course, it is wrapped up in the pain and tragedy of a death in the first place. So with sensitivity, we dive into these special cases. With regard to a woman who went, she and her husband overseas, so they take a trip. And I should also let you know, whenever you see the word overseas in Mishnah times, that means it's dangerous. Right? Any trip on a boat overseas was considered risky. Nowadays, with issues of illness on cruises, we might be able to understand that again. But back in the day, the oceans were dangerous. If the weather didn't get you, the pirates might. So this was something that had the potential for loss of life. It was implied within that very phrase. So if they go overseas together, if there was peace between him and her, that is to say, the couple were not fighting at the time, and there was also peace in the world, which is to say there was no war at the time, and the woman came back by herself and said, "My husband died," she may marry on the basis of her own testimony. Likewise, if she said, "My husband died," and they did not have children, but her husband did have a brother, she may enter into levirate marriage. So this is the we might say the original neutral position that we're going to be dealing with. The two go on a trip, she comes back and she says he's dead, and there was no reason to believe that there was enmity between them, and there was no reason to believe that there was an exceptional danger in the world that might have caused the opportunity for this lie, shall we say. That would be the backdrop of this this fabric, that would be the backdrop of a fabrication. If we don't have reason to suspect one way or the other, we take her at her word that her husband died while they were abroad. And of course, in the ancient world, you didn't normally ship bodies back home. You'd bury them where you were. Then we say, okay, she's a widow and she can get remarried.
Rabbi.
Yes.
How come we don't take her at her word if there's danger in the world?
So if there is danger in the world, there is a greater suspicion that either she or he might have been scheming in the process, that there might have been some level of deception, of lying, using the war as the backdrop. And 2,000 years later, from when the Mishnah was written down, we do have numerous stories of men who went off to war and used the war as a way of escaping from life, from their previous marriages and relationships. And we do have stories of women who use their husband going off to war to also say, oh, well, he died, and then go ahead and begin a relationship with someone else. Now, the other question you might be asking, and I'll just head you off at the pass, is why do we believe her? Normally speaking, Judaism does not allow the testimony of one person to carry anything like significant weight. And certainly you might be thinking that she has reason, ulterior motive, to say that her husband died, if that means that she is now freed. The reason the Gemara gives is that she may indeed have some reason to want to say her husband died, but the risk that she faces of her husband returning and confronting her with her deception, with the fact that she would then be prohibited to her husband and prohibited to the man that she had knowingly entered into adultery with, and the fact that the children she might have had from that subsequent relationship would be considered mamzerim, that the rabbis consider is enough of a disincentive that as long as we have no other reasons to suspect her, we assume that she is not going to risk all that to dissolve this relationship in this sort of way. And so we take her at her word.
But Rabbi, all those problems would still be there even if there was a war or some other danger, because it says she is with him. I thought the reason they believe her is because they're at peace and they were on good terms, so that would take away some of the reasons to lie.
Well, it does indeed, which is indeed why in the alternative, which is that there is danger or strife between them, that we need additional evidence in addition to her testimony. Let me go ahead and finish that text so that we can get that on the table for everyone. If there was peace between him and her when they left, but there was war in the world, or if there was a quarrel between him and her and peace in the world, meaning if one of the other conditions was not true, and she came and said, my husband died, she is not deemed credible, as she may be mistaken or lying. There are more reasons to believe either that she is jumping to the conclusion that he died in the war, or that she is lying because she is desperate to get out of this relationship. And thus, we cannot immediately say that she is to be treated as a widow, but must instead say more investigation is needed. Rabbi Yehuda says she is never deemed credible when she testifies that her husband died, unless she came crying and her clothing was torn, in which case it is apparent that she is speaking the truth. So he wants to have the outward signs of grief in order for us to believe her. They said to him, meaning the rest of the rabbis say to him, this is an incorrect distinction, right? You're wrong. Rather, both this woman, meaning the one who cries, and this woman who does not cry, may marry on the basis of their own testimony. In the Gemara's discussion of this, they make a very good observation, which is if you make tears and torn clothing the basis, all you are doing is teaching women who are willing to lie how to fake it, and you are punishing women who may not show grief so easily or may not have thought to come before the court crying or with torn clothes, that you are now punishing them, these honest women, by forcing them to remain trapped to a man that is actually dead. So if you make this outward display somehow your benchmark, then you are only going to help those who are going to exploit the system rather than help those who are in need of release in order to be honest widows. So Rabbi Yehuda's position is shot down, and however she shows up, whether she looks happy about it or whether she looks sad, if we have no additional reason to suspect that there may have been either error or lie, we accept her testimony on its own, and we allow her to be treated as a widow, meaning free to remarry.
Rabbi.
Yes.
So how come this Mishnah with Rabbi Judah, they rebut his testimony with saying, if we make this the rule, she'll know how to lie. But in other parts of the Mishnah, we assume they don't know how to lie so well.
So it's not a question of just saying she'll know how to lie. It's saying that you would be punishing those who don't. It's not just a question of not teaching wickedness, but it's also a question of punishing those who are innocent. And both of those are a strong consideration. There's the additional element that the rabbis were always of a, that's the right way to put this, especially when talking to a lawyer. The rabbis were always a little concerned about counseling, about coaching. In some places, they considered it to be such a apparent problem that they would try to remove any influence from counseling and coaching at all. In other places, they considered it to be not such a major problem. And so they did listen to what the person said and try to ignore whether or not they might have investigating whether or not they might have been taught the certain key phrases. But it's a very difficult line to walk when all you have in the ancient world is oral testimony, a few written documents here and there and other things, but by and large, most situations were settled based upon the words people spoke. And so the rabbis were reluctant to throw out all words just because the person might be lying, but they also were reluctant to do anything that would make it more likely that people would lie, or make it more likely that innocent people would be run over by the legal system. So it isn't, there is no easy distinction to make.
Right.
And yes, again, I apologize. In the ancient world, lawyers were not considered to be good faith advocates working on behalf of their clients. They were considered to be acting coaches who were teaching people how to lie under oath in order to say the right words to get what they wanted.
Right. But I thought, wasn't an idiot one of them? They made the distinction that if a person who was hiding could have lied, that they could have done a better job of hiding, we believe them.
So
which
in
was
many
another situation.
In many
Right.
financial situations, if a person could have lied more to their advantage, and meaning that what they said was A, but if they had wanted to lie, they could have said A plus one, that they could have come up with a better lie, then we assume that the statement they made wasn't a lie, right? If someone said, I went to the Olympics and I won a bronze medal, we generally would assume that they're probably not lying, because if they were going to lie about it, they would have said they won a gold. Now, that's generally the case for financial situations. That's not the case for when we're talking about criminal investigations. So if the person is saying, so-and-so murdered such and such, the fact that they said they only murdered one person and they could have lied and said they murdered two, that doesn't give more weight to their testimony. All right, now Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are going to argue about this. Now, it's been a while since we've talked about Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, so just a quick refresher before we dive in, because we're going to be sticking with them for a second. Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai literally means the house of Hillel, the house of Shammai. Hillel and Shammai were two of the greatest sages, well, ever, but they lived at the time near the end of the second temple period, excuse me. And their students collectively became known as the Beit of Hillel, or the Beit of Shammai, the house of Hillel, the house of Shammai. You might call them in modern terms schools of thoughts. These are the houses that continue to perpetuate their teachings and their rulings and their wisdom. However, as is explained in other parts of the Mishnah and our tradition, the students were not quite equal to the masters. So while Hillel and Shammai occasionally argued, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai often argued because they did not have the same skill at expressing themselves, understanding their opponent's opinions, and they often simply did not remember the words of their own teacher correctly or with enough insight and skill. So it is very common to find arguments between them. However, what we're going to see in this particular one, which I like very much, is that we're going to see Beit Hillel, who were usually the stronger of the two academies, the two schools of thought. We're going to see Beit Hillel recant. They will change their mind based upon Beit Shammai's opinion. And it is a wonderful reminder that no one should ever be so stubborn as to refuse to change their opinion or realize they made a mistake once it has been pointed out clearly. And one should always be gracious, of course, that when someone else has made a mistake, to point it out to them politely and properly, and not gloat over the fact that they were wrong. So with that as a little introduction about the morality of having a good argument, let's see what happens. Beit Hillel says, we heard that one may accept the testimony of a woman concerning the death of her husband only when she comes from the grain harvest, and when she testified in the same country where he died, and in circumstances similar to the incident that occurred, in which a lenient ruling was issued, as will be explained. We'll get there eventually. Beit Shammai said to Beit Hillel, No, 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 no. The same halacha, the same rule applies to a wife who comes from the grain harvest as who comes from the olive harvest, and also one who comes from the grape harvest, and even to one who comes from one country to another country. Although, yes, the incident in question took place during the grain harvest, the sages spoke of the grain harvest only because it was the present occurrence, meaning this is what happened in practice. But this is no proof that she is deemed credible only when she arrived specifically from the grain harvest. The Mishnah comments, Beit Hillel retracted their opinion and decided to teach in accordance with the opinion of Beit Shammai on this issue. So Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel took the specifics of the incident as being legally significant. And certainly in other times we've seen the specifics sometimes are very, very important. We just finished huge sections of Yevamot where the exact identity and mental capacity of different members within a relationship or the age at which they entered in that relationship all makes a huge difference in how it will be handled. Here, however, it was an example that if she shows up from the grain harvest with such and such an incident and in the same country, then this is what we believe. And Beit Shammai is pointing out that was just one incident. It wasn't the only incident that can occur. And other cases where a woman shows up and gives this testimony, no matter what the cause of death was, no matter where she is coming from, she is believed. And that would be fine. Let's go ahead and do Mishnah 3 because we still have a bit of time and I want to move on so that we can continue this idea. Beit Shammai says, a woman who testifies that her husband died may marry and take the money guaranteed in her marriage contract. So not only can she remarry, that we talked about in our very first section, but she can also get her ketubah. Beit Hillel says she may marry. They do agree about that, as we saw from the very first Mishnah of chapter 15, but she may not take her marriage contract, meaning she can't get her ketubah money, as qualified witnesses are required for monetary matters, and her being a single person does not count as qualified witnesses. And since we know from money matters, we have that standard, even if we allow her testimony to work for her marriage situation, we don't allow it to work for the money situation. Beit Shammai said to them, excuse me, if you have permitted a woman potentially forbidden to him, which is a relatively stringent prohibition, adultery and all that, based merely upon her own testimony, will you not permit a monetary matter, which is obviously more lenient, as the money can be returned, and this sin does not entail such a severe punishment? Knowingly entering into adultery can lead to the death penalty under some circumstances. There is no financial crime that leads to death penalty. So if you'll accept her testimony for a matter of life and death, will you not accept her testimony for a matter of money? Beit Hillel said to them, there is no proof, as we find that the brothers do not come into inheritance from the deceased brother based on her testimony. Right? So yes, evidently, although her testimony is accepted with regard to forbidden sexual relationships, it is not effective for monetary matters. What they're pointing out is that, look, the brothers don't get to inherit from their deceased brother just because she says he's dead. Yes, she can remarry, but they don't get to inherit because we don't have sufficient evidence of his death to distribute his estate among the heirs. So clearly, if the brothers can't inherit, neither can she. Beit Shammai responds, but we can learn this halacha from the scroll of the marriage contract, from the ketubah itself, as every husband writes for her that if you marry another man, take what is written for you in this contract. Meaning, this shows that her right to receive the money of her marriage contract is dependent upon her eligibility to remarry. In this case, as she is deemed credible when she says her husband died and she may marry again, she is likewise entitled to the money of her marriage contract, of her ketubah. And Beit Hillel again retracted their opinion and decided to teach in accordance with the opinion of Beit Shammai. So they again admit, you know what, you've got a good point there. From now on, indeed, we are going to teach that if she can get remarried, then she can also collect her ketubah, just as you have explained, Beit Shammai. Way to go, both parties, for actually listening to each other, entering into good faith debate, and being willing to sharpen their understanding of Torah in order to better make sure that we are better serving what God wants us to do. Any questions up through Mishnah 3, which is where we're going to call it for tonight?
Was there any commentary? I noticed that when Hillel took the opinion of Shammai, it was one of the rare instances Shammai was more lenient.
Well, so again, is it Shammai being lenient, Beit Shammai being lenient, or is Beit Shammai being stringent on her right to collect the ketubah? Right, stringence and leniency are two sides of the same coin. So
right.
Indeed, Beit Shammai is being more lenient, in quote, in allowing her to collect from the estate, but you could just as easily formulate that as saying Beit Shammai is being stricter in demanding that she be allowed to exercise her rights to collect from the estate.
Right, he's being more lenient in regards to the evidentiary standard,
which is, one point within the web of decisions that are being made. And yes, they have a lower bar for that, but that might be because they have a higher bar of making sure that the obligation to her in the ketubah is fulfilled. There's no such thing as anybody that is lenient on everything or anybody that is strict on everything. It's a question of where are you choosing to put your weight? What are you leaning on? And indeed, in general, for most of our feelings, Beit Shammai tends to demand more of people than Beit Hillel demands of people. But it's a little bit slippery to use that as a blanket statement of just leniency and stringency. Because as we can see, in this case, they're being lenient in one aspect, but they're being more demanding of the other. And vice versa for Beit Hillel. All right, so we will leave it there for today. Next week, we will pick up. Oh, sorry, question?
Yes, I have a question. Hello, Rabbi. If she doesn't collect the money, who collects the money? Who will benefit from her appearing as if she's lying? If the husband is dead, where would then the money or the reward would go to?
Well, so the money would end up being basically trapped, because if there's no proof that he has died, then the money cannot go to the heirs. It cannot go to the children. It cannot go to his brothers. If there are children, then it's a slightly different category. But it can't go to his brothers, which would be the main competitors, if you will. But once the brothers can collect, then certainly she could also collect her ketubah. The ketubah is written in a very careful manner that allows it to be collected first and foremost from any funds from the estate. So if he only had enough money to settle the ketubah, then she gets 100%. If there is enough for the ketubah and then 2 additional dollars in the estate, she gets the whole ketubah, and then his brothers each get $1. So if the money is released, she's getting her ketubah. If the money's not released, then it stays part of his estate until his status can be determined. But once it's determined, it gets released again to her. But as this is pointing out, she has a priority here over the brothers, meaning that if she is free to remarry because her testimony is believed, then she is also allowed to take her ketubah as she leaves from his household. So even if the brothers can't collect off the estate, she can.
And Rabbi,
yes,
if the money's trapped, she could still take from the estate for maintenance because he has an obligation to maintain her. And if he's not around to do that, she can take out her own will a certain amount, right?
Correct. She does have the right to be maintained by his household. That is part of the obligation that he/his estate has to her. All right, great questions. And we will continue along this theme of conversation, and with regards to testimony in these types of matters in our next week's class. So please remember that we have our upcoming Tisha B'Av commemoration. We are joining with the Rabbinic Assembly and the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism on Saturday night through the Rabbinical Assembly YouTube channel for the chanting of Eicha, the Book of Lamentations. And then we are joining with our Greater Orlando community on Sunday at 9 o'clock at Temple Israel in person. Please still wear masks. And we are also live streaming that through the Temple Israel website, or you can use the regular Temple Israel Zoom link for the Sunday Minyan. So 3 ways to participate. No excuses. Tisha B'Av is a time for all of us to be together, to draw strength from our community. So please do make every effort to connect one way or another. Take care, everyone, and be well.